On today's show, the bullet point, our top four topics in the areas of news, technology, politics, and entertainment. Choose the one you want to hear the most by visiting our Mastodon page at mastodon.vtip.me/at what you missed. Choose one out of the four and I'll read it for you live. Then, breaking news in the areas of politics, national and international stories, live on air as it happens. Plus, the most interesting articles I can find from the Washington Post, CNBC, Variety, Business Insider, The Hollywood Reporter, and more. Then, a moment of Krug, a Paul Krugman op-ed that is a must-read. All of that and what you may have missed in the news today. Stay tuned. Welcome to today's show, everyone. I am your host, Eric Darnley Small, and on today's show, I hope you will indulge me a little bit. It is going to be a little bit unique show. It is not the normal show that I want to do or that I usually do, but two very important storylines over the weekend, last week, and they hit late on Friday. And they're a little bit off topic because I feel like I need to cover some basic political ground, and I'm sort of going to go behind the curtain here. And I want to reveal to you a little bit more about myself and how I view politics in the process. And then I want to go over these two significant stories that happened late last week that I don't want you to miss out on because I think they're extremely important if you're a Democrat, if you're a liberal, if you're somebody who is concerned about the Democratic Party, concerned about Joe Biden, concerned about 2024 and us being unable to, get what we need to get. There are some signs of hopium. This is a new term that's out there nowadays that you may have heard that really people should be leaning into and should be thinking about to give them the sort of energy and to give them the desire to move forward. But first, I want to talk about what makes up a political group, right? Whether it's the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, each of these parties have their own coalitions, right? So, and we know these coalitions by their ideology, and their ideology informs their policies, and their policies become law. So, what is a coalition? A coalition is a group of people who have come together to work for a common goal. So when I talk about the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, I am talking about this coalition, this group of people that have decided to come together to exercise political power so that their ideology is turned into law. In the past, the group of people that call themselves the Republican Party, the grand old party, were made up of a coalition that was best defined by Ronald Reagan's three-legged stool, right? You had the Hawks, you had the evangelicals, and then you had the coalition of business folks, free marketers types. These are people who were about gutting regulation and were about, so concerned over the debt and deficit. Years later, I think the libertarian small government sort of merged themselves into the party as well. But basically you have this three-legged stool. And in general, this is the way it's been in the Republican Party since Reagan famously formed this group that became the so-called Reagan Coalition. You can see their policies enacted throughout the years in tax cuts, gutting of regulations, cutting of unions, going after collective bargaining. You would see war spending on these so-called military industrial complex. You would see policies that institute more Christian doctrine into our public lives, i.e. prayer in school, anti-sodomy laws, anti-abortion laws, etc. So that's the coalition that makes up and has made up the Republican Party. At least it did prior to Donald Trump. And there's a big argument to say, basically the Hawks were pushed out of the party and the Christian coalition sort of swallowed the whole party whole. But on the Democratic side, the ideological base of the party has always been centered around the fight for civil rights, workers' rights, LGBTQ rights, and women's rights, and policies and judicial goals that are maintained by growing as needed the social programs, which include Medicare, which would also include healthcare, Medicaid, Social Security, and welfare. So, for the most part, the struggle between the two parties are centered around the government's ability to implement these two competing visions of America and what government should be doing. What we've seen over the years is an attack on the Democratic coalition from the Reagan Republicans, right? Beginning in the 1980s, using the courts, using legislation, using the power of the presidency, the GOP has been incredibly successful in undermining and pushing back against the Democratic coalition. And make no mistake, the Democratic coalition has not always been very unified. The party has famously been all over the map when it comes to these particular issues, such, you know, stuff like spending. And you would see that in the so called Blue Dog Democrats or the Reagan Democrats of the past. And that fracture within the Democratic Party is still evident today. It still exists. But when Barack Obama was president and there was the Tea Party wave of 2010, the Republican Party was extremely successful in gaining considerable ground on the Democratic coalition. So while the Obama presidency was really historic for the nation and for the world, it was really regressive for the Democratic Party. Every single part of the coalition beginning with workers' rights, continuing on with civil rights, now today women's rights, have been under assault or severely damaged. But the attack on workers' rights is what I really want to focus on today because we may be seeing for the first time Democrats making a comeback, beginning with union rights to collective bargaining as well. Just take a step back for a moment, right? Unions are one of the most powerful forces within the Democratic coalition. Unions know how to organize and they know how to get their members to vote for a particular candidate or for a particular measure. And they know how to get their message out and the word out about a particular a subject matter or a particular law or a particular individual who needs to for Democrats to win needs to win votes. So to cripple the funding mechanism of a union is essential to help topple one of the essential coalitions within the Democratic Party, right? One of the most notable rulings coming out of the conservative Supreme Court was in 2018 in a case called Janus v. Acme, which public sector unions were could not force non-members to pay dues, even if they collectively bargained for the good of every employee, union or non-union employee. So doing this would effectively impact the funding mechanism for for the biggest unions all over, where the Democratic Party is simply weaker than it's ever been since the 1960s. But then these two stories came out last week, and there appears to be a comeback for the union and for Democrats. And I want to really get into this and really focus on these two stories so that we are, so that I don't want you to miss out on how important this is. And I remember in 2010 myself looking at this, what was happening in Michigan and what was happening in both Michigan and Wisconsin. And I'm going to get into Wisconsin in a minute, but first starting with Michigan, the attack on union rights was pretty extraordinary. And remember, Wisconsin and Michigan, these are two states that are unique. One is they were solidly Democratic. The Democrats were solidly in control of these two states, and they were considered blue states. And in addition, they were most importantly, they were union states. They were Rust Belt states. This is where your manufacturing was happening, and they were reliably Democratic. But with the attacks on union rights, that all became very iffy. And I think there's an argument, a very strong argument to make. That's why Donald Trump won against Hillary Clinton. But I want to go into this and go into this story because of how important it is. And the title is Michigan just became the first state in 6 decades to scrap an infamous anti-union law. Democrats empowered by the voters in 20, oops, let me go back. Uh, Democrats empowered by voters in 2022 overturned a right to work law as part of a sweeping pro labor agenda that's a model for other states. And this is from the Nation's website. This is the Nation Online. It's by John Nichols, February 16th, 2024. And John Nichols is somebody who's been on this beat, probably knows it better than just about anyone else. If you are an MSNBC watcher, if you're somebody who watched the Ed Schultz show, you would know that show was all about union rights, and it featured John Nichols on there quite a bit. I haven't seen him as much on MSNBC or in any other shows, but this is big news, and I expect you'll probably see this on MSNBC or in other media outlets, John Nichols talking about this. But it goes on to say, for the first time in almost 60 years, a state has formally overturned its so called right to work law, clearing the way for workers to organize new union locals, collective bargaining, and make their voices heard at election time. This week, Michigan finalized the process of eliminating a decades old right to work law, which began with the shift in control of the state legislature from anti union Republicans to pro union Democrats following the 2022 election. Let me go back. Okay, going forward. In addition to formally scrapping the anti labor law on Tuesday, that's Tuesday of last week, Michigan also restored prevailing wage protections for construction workers, expanded collective bargaining rights for public school employees, and restored organizing rights for graduate student research assistants at the state's public colleges and universities. But even amid all of these wins for labor, it was the overturning of the right to work law that caught the attention of unions nationwide. Starting in the formerly segregated states of the South, where such laws were rapidly enacted around the end of World War II to thwart the Congress of Industrial Organizations Operation Dixie campaign to organize multiracial unions across the region, this most destructive form of anti labor legislation was later adopted in Western states where mining unions had historically been strong and finally spreading to 2010s in the industrialized heartland of the Great Lakes region. Now the tide has begun to turn, beginning in a state with a rich labor history. And that's got the attention of union activists and working class people nationwide. Link, if there was a low point for the American labor movement in recent decades, there's a good case to be made that it became in 2012. It came in 2012 when Michigan adopted the right to work law that had been promoted by wealthy and corporate friendly Republican Governor Rick Snyder and approved by a Republican controlled legislation. One of the things you're going to find in this article is a lot of people who are now considered never Trumpers, a lot of the people who are considered quote unquote moderate Republicans, traditional Republicans. You're going to see a lot of these people watch. Schneider is one of them. I think Schneider has been on TV now more speaking out against the Republican Party. But it is important to remember who these people are and why they could never be Democrats, because they are fundamentally against one of the major coalitions within the Democratic Party, and that is unions. They're pro-business, quote unquote pro-business. The anti-labor legislation historically associated with southern states was now on the books in the state where Depression era sit-down strikes helped give birth to the powerful UAW, and where unions had from the 1930s onward done a better job of organizing than almost anywhere in the country. Implementation of Michigan's right to work law came shortly after Indiana, also a historically strong union state, enacted a similar measure, and shortly before another Great Lakes manufacturing state, Wisconsin, did the same. The movement to undermine the ability of workers to organize and collectively bargain was on the march in this period after Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker, with the support from right-wing donors such as the Koch brothers, attacked public sector unions in a high-profile 2011 struggle. Again, I just want to underline this point again. These are the never Trumpers. These are your traditional Reagan anti-union, pro-government, pro-business Republican Party, right? These are the ones that the media is running to today, hoping that they will save the Republican Party. We want to go back to that Republican Party. Well, no, we don't, right? These guys were anti labor through and through. And labor is essential for the Democratic Party to survive and for it to grow. And as well as for us to have a fairer country, a fairer electorate, more educated electorate, going on and on. But what's important here is that, and I'm going to talk about Wisconsin in a minute, but Governor Walker, and I followed this very closely when it happened, and John Nichols, who wrote this article, was on top of this more than just about anybody else. It was pretty extraordinary. Sherrod Brown, by the way, I think is up in right now for reelection. Um, but these measures to undercut unions were huge, huge news, and it was huge the amount of damage the Republican Party was willing to do. And Scott Walker, imagine Wisconsin. Wisconsin back then was like what Florida is today, and Scott Walker was the Ron DeSantis of his time. And like Ron DeSantis, he ran for president, and of course didn't go anywhere. But the Koch brothers, this whole coalition, they're all still around. They haven't changed. And when we look at never Trumpers, when we look at so called reasonable Republicans, these are the reasons why we as Democrats cannot have these people be swept in along with us. But let me continue. This is again continuing along in John Nichols' article here. Republican politicians like Mitt Romney, the party's 2012 presidential nominee, were promising to fight for right to work laws nationwide. In the U.S. Senate, Kentucky Republican Rand Paul would eventually attract 30 co-sponsors for his national right to work act. By the mid 2010s, 27 states had right to work laws on the books. New Hampshire's legislature blocked a proposed right to work law in 2017 and again in 2021, despite the fact that the measure was promoted by Republican Governor Chris Sununu. And in 2018, Missouri voters rejected a right to work referendum by a 67 to 33 margin. Let me just say, Chris Sununu is, I think, number one on the so-called reasonable Republicans, right? These are the ones that they're promoting now. They're going on shows talking about how terrible Trump is and all this kind of stuff, right? The other one is in Virginia. I can't think of that guy's name, the governor there, but also Larry Hogan, who is running in Maryland and is running for the Senate seat there. I don't know. He was a very popular governor, but I would be very curious because I think he's a business guy, and I would be very, very curious to see where he was on this right to work issue. And Democrats need to pound this issue with regard to Larry Hogan in Maryland, because uh, um, that's a very possible pickup for the GOP in Maryland. So very important that they hone in on this issue. People forget these things, right? You in the Trump era, people have forgotten how terrible the Republican Party and where they're bad on, what they're bad on, and why it is that they could never be considered Democrats and never be a part of our coalition. So just a reminder there. Chris Sununu as well. Jeez. In Michigan, after 2022 voting saw the reelection of Governor Gretchen Whitmer, a labor ally, and thanks to the overturning of gerrymandered legislative maps that had favored the GOP, the election of Democratic majorities in the state House and Senate. For the first time in 4 decades, the Democrats controlled all major levers of power in Michigan, and they used them to implement a sweeping pro-labor agenda. That was a significant shift for Michigan, to be sure, but it was also an indication of what could be done in other states across the Great Lakes region. So there you have it, folks. Um, Probably one of the, again, we've got this coalition. union rights coalition, extremely important because of the ability to organize and their ability to get out there and get the vote, um, and bring in new voters and bring in and send a message. I would also strongly urge people to look at the culinary union in Nevada, right? Nevada is being considered a swing, a quote unquote swing state, because the Harry Reid machine went after the culinary union, went after unions to bring them in the Democratic Party. And it is only because of the union workers in Nevada that there is any Democrats, particularly the senator, or House members. Right now, the governor is a Republican, but it is extremely important. The power of unions within the Democratic Party is extremely important in order for us to survive.